Ankles. That's the word. One word, buried inside a dispatch call that most people have listened to 100 times without ever slowing down enough to hear it. A dispatcher asks how high the water is. A voice on the other end answers, ankles. Then the call falls apart. Crosstalk. A second voice. A correction. And somewhere in that tangle of static and panic sits the entire case a family, a state agency, and half the internet have been fighting over for months. Imagine being on a boat that's taking on water and the only word you can get out is a body part. Imagine that word being the most stable, coherent thing anyone says for the next 40 seconds. Imagine a state marine resources department releasing that audio to the public, officially, on the record, and the internet doing what the internet does with 40 seconds of bad signal and a missing person. If you've already watched 3 other breakdowns of this call today, I understand. That fatigue is real, and it's exactly how a case like this quietly loses its shape, where the loudest interpretation wins instead of the most supported one. We're not doing that here. Tonight we're following one thread only, the distance between what was said on that call and what the record can actually confirm, and showing you exactly where that distance is widest. Here is what is confirmed. Flat. No interpretation. Nolan Wells was on a boat trip to Horn Island, off the Mississippi coast, on a holiday weekend when the island is at its most crowded. Hundreds of people, dozens of boats. At some point that afternoon, he was separated from the group he arrived with. He was later found unresponsive on the shoreline, days after he was reported missing. 2 autopsies followed, one conducted by the state, one conducted independently at the family's request. The state's early public position leaned toward accidental drowning. The family never accepted that conclusion, and their independent forensic pathologist, Dr. Roger Mitchell, returned a different finding. Not drowning, not homicide, undetermined. That word, undetermined, is where this case actually lives. Not in a verdict. In the space where one hasn't been reached. A marine emergency call was placed reporting the boat taking on water. That call was later released publicly by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. Not leaked, not pulled from a private recording. Officially issued. GPS data recovered from the boat afterward reportedly places its actual departure from the island around 4 in the afternoon, roughly 30 minutes after that call was made. Those 2 facts sitting next to each other are the spine of tonight's episode. Everything else is chapter work. The most widely circulated interpretation of the dispatch audio is that, underneath the caller's voice, other people on the boat can be heard saying Nolan's name and asking whether he is dead, before, according to every existing witness account, anything had happened to him yet. Here's what the record shows. The official audio, as released by the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources, is genuinely difficult to parse. The caller reports being at the west tip of the island, reports the bilge pump failing, reports taking on water, and struggles to answer basic follow-up questions: how high the water is, a membership number. That much is not in dispute. Multiple reporters covering the case independently confirm it's the same source file. What is in dispute is the background. No forensic audio examiner has published an analysis of the original file. Every enhanced or isolated version circulating online is unverified, meaning nobody has confirmed what audio processing was applied to produce it, or whether that processing altered the content rather than simply revealing it. Why does this deserve an answer instead of a verdict? Amplifying a noisy recording doesn't uncover hidden speech the way people assume it does. It amplifies everything already in the file: wind, engine noise, compression artifacts, and human hearing fills gaps with whatever it's already been told to expect. That's not an accusation against anyone circulating these clips. It's how audio works, which means the honest position is this: something is audible in that background. What it actually says has not been established by anyone qualified to establish it. That's not the same as saying nothing is there. Let's be precise about what this section does and doesn't prove. An unverified background voice saying a name is not evidence that something happened to that person before the boat left. It's evidence that the audio needs a forensic examiner, not a comment section. Keep that distinction in mind. You're going to need it again in a few minutes. A separate clip circulated online, allegedly of Nolan on the boat shouting, "Give me my phone back," was presented by some accounts as further evidence of what happened that day. Around the same time, other content, including at least one image purporting to show a young man face down and injured on the beach, was circulated and attributed to this case. Here's what the record shows. According to reporting on the case, the face-down beach image was confirmed not to depict Nolan Wells at all. Separately, another young man who was on the trip has stated on the record that the "give me my phone back" voice was his own, not Nolan's, a claim that, on close listening, aligns with what's on the actual audio. Reporters covering the story have also noted a broader pattern of fabricated material attached to this case, including AI-generated images and videos. Why does this deserve an answer? This matters for one reason. Once fabricated material enters a case's ecosystem, it doesn't stay contained. It gets cited by people who don't know it's fabricated, and it gets folded into the record by osmosis. Calling this out isn't a defense of anyone. It's basic hygiene for a case that has already been flooded with content designed to generate reactions instead of clarity. While the audio fight was happening online, something quieter was happening off of it. The family retained legal representation and their own forensic pathologist. Search and recovery organizations, including the United Cajun Navy, reached out to offer specialized resources, cadaver dogs, and scent-specific search dogs. According to the organization's president, that offer was made through the family's legal team, with a documented call between their incident commander and one of the family's attorneys. This is the part of the story that doesn't trend. It's also the part that tells you this stopped being an internet argument the moment professional search and recovery and independent forensic resources entered the picture. The dispatch call describes a boat actively taking on water at the west tip of the island. That's the emergency being reported, in real time, to a marine assistance line. Here's what the record shows. GPS data pulled from the vessel afterward reportedly shows it did not actually leave the island until approximately 4 in the afternoon, around 30 minutes after the emergency call was placed. Investigators have acknowledged this discrepancy needs to be resolved. Why does this deserve an answer? There are ordinary explanations available. A boat with a failed bilge pump doesn't necessarily go under in minutes, and staying put in shallow water near a beach is the reasonable move, safer than running for open water while taking on water. That's not a stretch. It's what most boaters would do, but there's a reasonable explanation, and the explanation has been given and confirmed are 2 different sentences, and right now only the first one is true. A 30-minute gap between a sinking boat emergency call and a boat's actual departure is not a small detail. It's the kind of gap that determines whether every other timeline in this case lines up or doesn't. According to an account from a friend who was on the trip, the last time he saw Nolan was sitting on the beach with a young woman he'd met that day. When the group prepared to leave, people on the boat reportedly called for Nolan to get on. Repeatedly. He declined, saying he'd ride back with someone else, something this friend describes as unremarkable for that particular island, where riding out with one group and back with another happens constantly. The young woman in question reportedly sent a message the following day describing the same sequence of events independently. Here's what the record shows. Reporting confirms this account exists and has been given to investigators. It has not been independently corroborated by physical evidence placing Nolan with a specific group after that point. Separately, another person close to Nolan has told investigators that this account doesn't match the person they knew, that splitting off from the group like that wasn't typical of him. Why does this deserve an answer instead of a verdict? Two things can both be true. People do out-of-character things constantly. A new beach, a new person, a holiday afternoon. And a first-hand account that conflicts with someone else's understanding of a person's normal behavior is exactly the kind of tension that shouldn't be resolved by whoever tells it more convincingly on camera. This has been sitting in the record since day one, unresolved, and it should stay labeled that way until it isn't. A Marine Patrol email surfaced describing Nolan's alcohol intake that day as heavy. Here's what the record shows. That's a description in a document. Toxicology results will either support it or they won't, and as of this reporting, that has not been publicly resolved either way. Photographs from the day reportedly show drinking was not isolated to one person in the group, and there are open questions asked directly on air to a named individual in at least one interview about how alcohol was obtained for a group that was largely reported to be under 21. Why does this deserve an answer instead of a verdict? Here's the honest limit of this evidence, stated plainly. Intoxication can help explain how someone ends up in the water. It cannot, by itself, explain a body recovered on a shoreline 2 days later, and it does not explain the findings, or the absence of findings, from either autopsy. It's a factor to track, not an answer to reach for because it's the easiest one available. The family's independent forensic pathologist, Dr. Roger Mitchell, concluded the cause of death was undetermined. Not drowning, not homicide. According to the family's attorney, two findings drove that conclusion. An area of discoloration on the back of the head, deep enough to sit beneath the skin and not publicly explained, and the fact that the body arriving for the second examination did not include the lungs or throat. Here's what the record shows. Organ retention after a first autopsy for further tissue study is standard practice. This is not, on its own, evidence of concealment, but the consequence is real regardless of intent. Lungs and throat tissue are precisely what a pathologist needs to speak with authority about drowning specifically. Without them, a second examination is working with meaningfully less to go on than the first one had. Why does this deserve an answer instead of a verdict? Drowning is what's called a diagnosis of exclusion. It isn't confirmed under a microscope directly. It's arrived at by ruling out everything else first. Trauma, strangulation, a medical event that happened before the water ever became a factor. Decomposition works against that process. The body wasn't recovered for days, and by the second examination, conducted roughly 4 days after the first, even under refrigeration, identifying trauma or natural disease had become significantly harder than it would have been in a fresh examination. Which means the record-supported, board-certified position here is genuinely uncomfortable for everyone watching, regardless of which version of this case they came in believing. Stating a definitive cause of death under these specific conditions is extremely difficult. That cuts against the early public leaning toward accidental drowning. It also cuts against the version of this story that treats undetermined as a quiet admission of something worse. Undetermined is not a cover-up, and it is not a verdict. It's a description of what the evidence can and cannot carry. Let's track where this has actually moved, institutionally, since day one. A state agency publicly released dispatch audio rather than letting it stay buried in a case file. A family retained independent legal counsel and an outside forensic pathologist rather than accepting the initial finding. A search and recovery organization with cadaver dog capability formally offered its resources through legal channels. None of that happens around a case that's already closed in anyone's mind. That's the difference between a story that's repeating itself online and one that's actually still moving through a process, and it's why this is getting another episode instead of a rerun. Here's what's actually confirmed. a distress call was placed and officially released by a state agency. A boat's GPS data reportedly places its departure roughly 30 minutes after that call. An independent forensic pathologist examined the body without lungs or throat tissue present, and, under conditions the field itself acknowledges make certainty extremely difficult, reached undetermined rather than a definitive cause. Here's what's still unknown. What is actually audible underneath that call has not been forensically confirmed by anyone qualified to confirm it. The 30-minute gap between the call and the boat's departure has not been publicly explained. The discoloration noted on the back of the head has not been publicly accounted for, and the tension between two people who each knew Nolan, describing two different versions of how he spent his last known hour, has not been resolved by either of them. None of that adds up to a verdict, in either direction. It adds up to a case where the honest word is still the one nobody wants to sit with. Undetermined. We'll keep tracking it as the record moves, not as the internet does.